ask if you have any question related to our research before we start the interview.
Not for now, but I'm wondering about the consent form. Do you want me to sign and send it to you today, or can I give it to you at a later date?
Um, Anything to your convenience. If you think you can possibly do it right now, you can. But if you think it's hard to do it right now, you can send us via email later.
Right, I'll send it via email to you later.
Thank you. So, this is the introduction to our OM 301 302 for year 3 in IFL. This will be recorded. And first of all, to start with, may you please introduce yourself, lecturer.
My name is Hayes Poppy. I am currently a lecturer at the Department of English, where I teach a wide range of subjects, including WS, LS, GS, and so on.
Thank you. Um, can you explain your experience with blended learning before?
In fact, it is my third year. It's been this is my third year teaching at IFL, but I had experience teaching blended learning class for only a semester. That is a period of around 5 months. So that's basically wrapped up my blended teaching experience.
Hello. Uh,
Hello.
can can you hear me?
Yes, 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 yes. Did you hear my answer earlier?
Uh, Sorry. Can you repeat the answer? I didn't hear.
Oh, okay. So this is actually my third year teaching at IFL, but I have taught blended learning class for only a semester. That is for WS 201, right around a year ago or so.
Thank you. Um, since you have experienced both face-to-face and blended learning, which one is your preferred choice?
For me, I think it is always the face-to-face, and that's for a number of reasons. I am number one, I'm much more comfortable teaching face-to-face class where you have a real life interaction with the students and things like that. And plus, with blended, you have to have structured off-campus session, and rather than having a structured off-campus session, I would prefer giving students assignment where they can come and talk to me in class at a later date and so on. So it's much more of a matter of preference in terms of how much I am comfortable in teaching. So if that's the standard, then I would go for a face-to-face classroom.
Thank you.
Although I do
Um,
understand that there are some benefits to blended learning as well, because that allows your student to work at their own pace and things like that. But ultimately, when it comes to a matter of preference, I would go to face-to-face.
thank you. Um, since you said you have a preference to face-to-face methodology, which one of uh, what do you find most useful in the face-to-face classroom?
By what do you mean? Like what sort of technique, what sort of method, or what sort of
Yes,
approach?
yes. Yeah. What sort of approach that you find most useful in a face-to-face classroom?
I think that's a very big question, in fact, if you ask me about approach in general. But if I have to answer, I would find inquiry-based approach is the most useful. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term inquiry-based approach, but what it essentially is, it's a form of teaching or a form of school of thought that really focus on encouraging students to ask questions. So ultimately, student is at the center of the learning, and there are different forms of inquiry based. You can have one that is very open, or in which students are the one who define problem, focus on what they want, and then introduce it to teacher, and we worked on that. But that was too open, and unfortunately, we cannot introduce that since we have a curriculum or content to cover within the context of our school. So we can have a more structured inquiry-based approach in which teacher would introduce question and allow students to explore on that. So I think that is the most useful approach for me in terms of teaching.
Um, do you find such approach to be able to be implemented into a blended learning environment?
Of course, I think inquiry-based learning would work in different sort of context. It's a matter of how teacher would adapt it. In real classroom, for example, I mean, this is just broadly categorized. I won't go specific. In real classroom, for example, you can have especially introduce students to a kind of essay writing and things like that, and ask students to work on that, develop, different kind of patterns, different kind of structure that they want to write an essay before really going into teaching them how to write it. So students do the exploration on their part first before teacher would go and try to, confirm their finding or introduce different ways that they can deal with the questions. And there in blended classroom, of course, it pretty much worked on the same way. The only difference is that students will be able to do that at any later time that they want, or it's a matter of design, or students are assigned to set a specific set or deadline that they're supposed to finish the task by that deadline or at their own convenience, place, and time, and things like
Thank you. Um, can you elaborate, since we are talking about blended learning environment, since you have taught somewhat in a blended learning environment, which approach you find useful in a blended learning environment?
and also approach, right? In blended
Yes.
learning. I think that inquiry-based one was actually the most useful in inquiries-based learning, but that really depends when it comes to teacher perspective and when it comes to students' perspective. From a teacher perspective, introducing an inquiry-based learning was actually a hallmark of the 21st century teaching style. That means you're no longer the one who manage everything for the students. You're no longer the one who design or pinpoint exactly what student needs to know. Students are the one who do the exploration, and we are proud of that kind of method, or you can prefer to call it inductive if you want. That is the hallmark that we are proud of from a teacher perspective. But I do understand the limitation when I try to understand students' perspective, because exploration style of study does not work for everybody. There are students who would definitely, I think, prefer a more guided approach in which I don't want to use the term spoon feed because that carries negative connotation, but in a ways there are students who would prefer everything to have been done and presented to them so that it's easier for them to digest the content. So I think personally for me, inquiry based learning would work the best, but taking into consideration students preference and different learning style, I do have to say that a more deductive approach would tie at the top with inquiry based learning, depending on. So the answer ultimately is boiled down to the type of learners that I have, the type of the preference that of learners as well.
Thank you. Um, so moving on to classroom activities, how does blended learning environment affect your method or curriculum in the classroom?
So this is basically about face-to-face classroom, right? How the blended learning affects face-to-face.
Um, it's somewhat both between the online interaction and the face-to-face classroom.
So I'll answer this in two parts. First, we'll talk about how blended learning style in general affects the face-to-face teaching, and then we'll also talk about how it affects the online interaction too. On the first part related to face-to-face teaching, I think blended, because there are different forms of blended learning, and I have to, before I answer, I have to introduce you to the sort of blended learning we have at our educational institution, or at least for WS subject back in the year that I was teaching. So what we have is generally we have 15 weeks in general, as you already aware of that. And among those 15 weeks, we have 4 off-campus sessions overall. And generally, off-campus sessions are designed specifically to allow students time to write their essay at home. So because in WS2, 201, at least we are going to introduce students to different kind of essays, and for each essay, student would need to write in a form of journal and so on. That's why every off-campus session is designed specifically, or at least in theory and in curriculum, are for students to stay at home and then write the essay. So if we abide by this standard or this curriculum, that means what the most different blended learning make to a face-to-face classroom or a real classroom is the fact that it take the work out of the real classroom. Meaning if you are teaching non-blended, WS2 non-blended, teacher and student will have to sit in class together while students are working on their work, an essay, and so on. But with blended learning, student can do all that work from home, right? So they're doing that work at the most comfortable environment, I assume, um, and at their own pace and so on, as long as they can complete the work within that day. So I think that's one main difference that blended learning make to off-campus, to classroom, to real classroom interaction. Number two, because the structure of blended learning that we are supposed to have is, it's not is we are using online platform, be it Google Classroom, Schoology, and things like that, as a storage of information for students. That means in each class, students are expected to more or less read the materials that they're supposed to work on today before class. At this point, I would like to distinguish a bit as well. I'm not sure if you heard of the term flipped classroom, but in our context of blended learning, there is element of flipped classroom in there. But what a flipped classroom essentially is that normally all the content and the studies and the reading materials are done or are completed at home by the students. So in class, when students come to class, it's only about practice and activity. So in the style of blended learning that we have in the institution, there's also an element of flipped classroom in which students are, assigned more or less, depending on the teacher, to read the material or to watch certain videos. So all the readings are done by them before they attend class. So that is one of the that is the second difference that a blended learning make to a real classroom as well. But of course, in real classroom, sometimes students assign, teachers assign student to do the reading task at home as well. So that's pretty much similar, but in blended, I think it makes a big, that was starkly clear in a sense that teacher would upload material, specifically storage in a certain place so students can read it and things like that. So that is one thing that it makes as well. And I think the third thing that a blended learning style make a difference is in terms of assessment and interactions. Normally assessment with real classroom. Let's use the term real classroom for now because I don't want to say it for long, meaning face-to-face
Yes.
interaction. In a real classroom, real physical classroom, that means generally feedback are given to student in form of written form. Teacher take their work and then just write a few comments on that paper and then send it back to students and things like that. But in blended classroom, if in the best case scenario where teacher have enough time to work on student, to go through student work, then of course feedback can be given to students via online, and it's in a sense it's easier, one, for data storage, student won't keep losing their paper. Number two, feedback can be more detailed as well, and we have technology assisted feedback. That means through the use of tools such as Grammarly, for example. I'm not saying that those kind of tools would override the role of teacher, but I think that's a part of what I call, at least in my own definition, technology assisted feedback. So that teacher won't have to, go through all the grammar point, although teacher will still have to read. That is in the best case scenario of when teacher have time in order to read students' work. But if teachers don't have time, then that's another issue that we need to discuss further. Now, with regard to the second part of how blended learning make a difference to online interaction, right?
Yes.
I think normally, officially, before blended learning, teacher and student online interaction were not really a part of the curriculum, at least not officially. I mean, you talk about social medias and things like that. I'm sure that's we would categorize that into what we call unofficial online interaction. That means teacher are interacting at